A lot of people ask me in my Facebook music ad videos whether it's better to use Hypeddit or ToneDen as a landing page from their Facebook ads, because I've used both and I recommend both essentially, but I've never really known for sure like if there's a distinct difference statistically between the two. So in this video, we're going to answer that question. And to do that, I brought in an MIT engineering student named Kyle. And he's actually a member of my course, which, by the way, you can find a link in the description if you want to join that. And he kind of just posted one day he was doing this experiment. So he's going to go through all the super nerdy details on which one is better or not. So with that said, let's introduce you to Kyle.
Hey everyone, it's Kyle here. I have my PC open with Ads Manager all loaded, and I'm ready to first walk you through how I set up this experiment, what kinds of things I was looking for, and the results I got, and finally, and most importantly, what I learned from this experiment. Let's dive right into Ads Manager, which I'm sure you're familiar with at this point. And right off the bat, you can just ignore these top two campaigns I have running. That's for like a new release that I'm promoting right now. The ones we're going to be looking at are these two. So Montauk was the name of the song, and I have two campaigns. One is set up with a ToneDen conversion, and one that's set up with a Hypeddit conversion. So the way my setup for this experiment worked is basically I had two campaigns that were almost identical, and the only difference between the two of them was the conversion event. So for the ToneDen campaign, I used the ToneDen view content, and for the Hypeddit campaign, I used the Hypeddit smart link click event. So that was really the only difference between the two of them. And then I can even show you the details of how my targeting worked. So each campaign has 4 ad sets that are split up based on geography into tier 1 through 3 markets, and HCLC, which stands for high click low conversion, which is, it's probably something you guys don't specifically have to worry about, but it's just for my music specifically, there's some markets that have a tendency to click on my ad at a high rate but don't actually click through the landing page and convert, which kind of messes up my budget, so I put them in their own ad set just for testing. But probably not something you guys have to worry about, but it's just something that I'm going to explain because I know the question will come up. And then all 4 of these ad sets are using the same list of artists that I identified as being similar to my own music for the targeting. And so things like, for example, Green Day or Blink-182, since I do pop punk music. The only country I completely excluded was India, and Andrew already has a good explanation for why we exclude India in our ads. And this is what the budget looked like within one campaign. So tiers 1 and 2 each got $3. Tiers 3 and HCLC got $2 each, and so that's $10 going to each campaign every day. So $70 ad spend over the course of 1 week for both campaigns. And I ran this test over the course of 1 week. I targeted ages 16 to 50, and these are the placements I use. So Facebook newsfeed, Instagram feed, Marketplace, video feeds, Explore, all 3 stories, and Facebook in-stream. And this is going to become important in just a little bit. And then finally, targeting all languages. They must match Spotify, and detailed targeting expansion is off. So with that being said, what was I looking for in terms of performance? So the obvious is looking at things like how many results did I get over the course of the week, and what was the average cost per result. But there was one other metric that I was interested in tracking, and this is what I call click-through rate, which is the number of results or the number of conversions. I'm going to use the word result and conversion interchangeably. So results divided by clicks, which basically tells you on top you have how many people total converted divided by the total number of people who clicked on the ad. Because as I mentioned, I had problems with some markets with people getting to the landing page and then just leaving instead of going to Spotify. So I use that as my third critical metric to compare these two. And if you just look at face value at the top level, what Ads Manager shows you on the welcome screen, ToneDen campaign got 99 conversions after a week, and the Hypeddit got 103. And the cost per result is like pretty much the same. So you're probably scratching your head like, why would we even make a video on this? That's the most boring result ever. Just say they're the same and move on. It turns out there's actually some really interesting things to be learned when you dive into the data. This is the big sheet I was using to track all of the results, and there's a lot of numbers and scary math, but I promise I'll just show you what the important parts are. So these are our daily stats, and I use these to calculate the average amount of results I got per day, as well as the average cost per result and click-through rate over the course of the 7-week period that I ran this test. And what I found is that on average, the Hypeddit campaign, which I'm showing on the left here in orange, had 14.7 results per day, and the ToneDen had 14.1. So it's roughly the same. I know some people are ready to jump at the comments section and say like, oh, that 0.6 makes a big difference, but I'll address that in a second. And cost per result, about 70 cents for the Hypeddit and 87 cents for the ToneDen. I'm going to put a little asterisk next to that. Like, I know these numbers are not good. That's a very expensive cost per result, and you should be trying to get it much lower. And as a matter of fact, I have now going forward, because I learned things from this campaign that helped me make smarter decisions about my targeting going forward. And then finally, we have the click-through rate, which is where it gets really interesting. So the Hypeddit on average 32%, again, not great, but I've learned how to optimize that from here. And ToneDen at 20%. So that's actually a big difference. And I can kind of back up my claims of like what's a big difference or not, because I have these p-values which I calculated, which are from the z-test. So there's a lot of like really frightening math and statistics that goes into this, but the most convenient way to explain a p-value is it tells you what is the percentage probability that the result that we saw is due to random chance. So in our case, the result is the performance difference between a Hypeddit landing page and a ToneDen landing page. And in terms of results per day, my p-value is telling me there's a 35.5% chance that this is not due to random chance, which means it's not statistically significant. So any p-value less than 5 tells you I have a result that I need to pay attention to. This is significant, and this is not due to random chance. Very improbable that it's due to random chance anyway. So if you're looking at like results per day and cost per result, they're all like pretty big probabilities. But when you look at results per click, you stop and say, holy mackerel, that's a lot less than 5%, right? So what's interesting is I found that there's not a significant difference between results per day and cost per result, but there is a very significant difference between click-through rate. But how does that make any sense? How is it the ToneDen is able to lose more people from like leaving the landing page, but still maintain a pretty similar cost per result? Well, that's where I started really looking to the numbers and crunching the data. So if we go back into Ads Manager, and I'll show you kind of the thought process as I walk through this. I want to draw your attention to the very first day that I ran this campaign. So if we go to August 14th was the day I started it, and we're just going to highlight that. So that's just showing us from that day, and we could see like actually the ToneDen campaign only got 4 results, and they were really expensive. It was terrible performance. These are all related, by the way. Then we're going to go to Breakdown, Delivery, and we're going to look at Platform. So this is, we're going to look at Placements. And this is the places on Facebook and Instagram where my ad was shown. So things like Instagram Explorer, all of the stories, etc. And this is a really interesting insight that I learned here. So on my first day, the ToneDen campaign put $4 out of its $10, so that's 40% of its budget, into just the Facebook newsfeed, whereas the Hypeddit campaign put $2.92, that's 29% of its budget, into that placement. And you might be saying, well, this rounds to 3, so 3 and 4, what's the difference, right? That actually is a big difference, right? That's a 33% increase that the ToneDen put 33% more of its budget into that one placement right off the bat. And so the first really interesting thing that I learned is even though these campaigns are almost identical except for their conversion event, right? Same targeting, same ad videos, etc. What happened is the Facebook manager decided a priori, which means without knowing anything about how these campaigns perform, to optimize, so to speak, the budget placement within different placements. And it decided for some reason to put more of the ToneDen campaign's budget into news feeds really quickly. So what that tells me is even though that the Hypeddit conversion and the ToneDen conversion to a person is the same, right? For you and me, it's just clicking a button on a landing page that takes us to Spotify. But to Facebook Ads Manager, it actually perceives them as different conversion events, and it tries to distribute the budget accordingly and differently. And that actually also explains why or at least it kind of explains why I had such poor performance on the first day in the ToneDen, because I really do think that putting all this budget in the newsfeed was kind of a misallocation on Ads Manager's part. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. And what I found towards the end of the week is that the budget distribution, actually I can go back to showing you the whole week, the budget distribution between different placements pretty much ended up converging to the same thing. So that tells me after a week, Facebook kind of caught on that they're really the same conversion event effectively for people, and at the end of the day, we're targeting people, right? And that's why it kind of changed the placements so that they're relatively the same. Now, that doesn't quite answer the question, why is it that the ToneDen had such a small click-through rate? So this is, all of these things are related. It's coming together like a puzzle. So this is Facebook newsfeed, which I said ToneDen put a lot more of its budget into. And if we look at the number of results versus the number of link clicks, we had 23 results come out of 287 link clicks. So if we do the math, that's probably just less than 10%, but I'll compute it out anyway. Yeah, so that's like an 8% click-through rate, which is really, really bad, actually. Surprising. And let's compare that to something like Instagram Stories, for example, looks a lot better, or even Instagram Feed. So that's 23 results coming out of 38 link clicks, and that's a much more palatable 61% click-through rate, right? That's a lot better. So what that tells me is that the placement that you choose on Facebook and Instagram has a huge impact on the click-through rate, right? So someone who sees your ad in Instagram Explorer, that's the best click-through rate, which makes sense, because if you're on Explorer, you're telling Instagram, hey, find me something interesting to distract me, right? I want to find something new. I'm exploring, right? So people who are going to find your ad there are more likely to click through your landing page and go to see the music. Whereas with newsfeed, they're probably more casual observers, and they're kind of just surfing content or whatever, and they might see to check it out because they're kind of curious, but they're not curious enough to click through. And that's what I think explains the discrepancy between the click-through rate, that newsfeed is consistently, in all the campaigns I've run, the worst click-through rate. Now, I'm going to stop you in the tracks right there. That doesn't mean don't run ads on newsfeed, right? Because it happens that, this one's kind of not a great example, but if we look here, newsfeed was actually my cheapest placement, even though it still had a pretty abysmal click-through rate. What that tells me is that impressions on newsfeed are really cheap. So even though the click-through rate is bad, it's good at generating enough link clicks that eventually enough people do get through and convert, balanced with the low cost there, that you still get a really cheap cost per result on that placement. And it kind of balances out versus Stories, which has a great click-through rate, but it's really, really expensive actually. Because other bands are also trying to target Stories and Instagram in general, so you have to compete with them, and that's why the ad space is more expensive. You have to pay more per impression on those platforms. And then I actually have no idea what the heck happened with Instagram Explorer here. It was like almost $6. It's pretty atrocious, but it just goes to show that there's a lot of random gobbledygook that's happening behind the scenes, and sometimes it just behaves poorly. Like this Instagram Explorer was just better for some reason. But this trend of news feeds having a much worse click-through rate is something I've seen over and over again. And that's why the ToneDen campaign had a worse click-through rate, even though it maintained a similar cost per result, because this is a cheap placement, or relatively cheap, I should say. Relatively cheap placement that just has a bad click-through rate. So again, not telling you not to use these placements, but I'm just saying be aware of how they might affect your click-through rate. We've explained that click-through rate mystery, right? And we've also learned that Facebook Ads Manager optimizes for conversion events, even if it thinks they're different, but they aren't. But there's a few other things that I learned that are pretty interesting, actually. So we're going to look at another breakdown. We're going to go to delivery and then go to country. And this is another crazy, or I shouldn't say crazy, but pretty compelling trend that I noticed. General trend is that nations in the developing world have a much worse click-through rate than nations in the industrialized world. So for example, I'm going to just cherry pick some examples. If we look at Algeria, I had one result come out of 19 link clicks. I'm not going to do that math, but that's just better than 5%, which is a pretty bad click-through rate, right? Whereas Australia, and this is not a good example because it's one data point, one result out of 2 link clicks, which is closer to 50%. But this is a trend that we see across a lot of developing world. So Bolivia, 2 out of 13. and Chile is 7 out of 30. And so Germany went 3 for 3. So that's a 100% click-through rate for Germany. So 3 results came out of 3 link clicks. The good old US of A, so that's 3 results coming out of 5 link clicks, that's 60%. And this is something that's pretty much mirrored in this other campaign that I did for the ToneDen. So France, 2 out of 3, so that's 66% or 67%. Italy went 3 for 4. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is, and I'm not saying this to hate on or like throw shade on any countries, by the way, I should just throw that out there. But I'm saying is that developing nations, they tend to have a lower click-through rate. So people in the industrialized world, meaning the USA, Canada, Europe, and Japan, for example, are these users are more intentful when they click on an ad. So if they click on the ad, that means they're more likely to also click through the landing page and go to Spotify. So there's more intent behind when they click an ad. Whereas people in the developing world, maybe it happens that their internet is really slow, and when they click on your ad, it just takes too long to load the landing page, so they say, oh, no thanks, I'll just leave. I think that's actually a pretty reasonable explanation. But developing nations tend to have a worse click-through rate. Now, again, that's not to say you shouldn't advertise in developing nations. I'm just putting it out there to say, to give you a kind of a heightened understanding of what I've observed, so you can be more conscious of what your click-through rate is like and why it might not be what you want it to be, even if you're getting good results. And it's kind of the same thing with newsfeed, where even though the click-through rate is worse in developing nations, since the advertising space is so cheap there, you pay less per impression, it still comes out to a pretty competitive price per conversion. So I know I threw a lot of information at you, so I'm going to summarize the key points. So the first key point is there's really no difference in performance between a ToneDen landing page and a Hypeddit landing page, at least not that I could see in the 1 week I ran this test. So whatever you've been using and you're comfortable with using, just continue using that. The next important takeaway, so number 2, is that Facebook Ads Manager will optimize a priori, or before it knows anything about the campaigns, its budget placement, which I guess makes sense. But even conversion events that people would think are the same, Facebook could perceive them as very different conversion events and make pretty drastic changes to the way it distributes its budget across countries and placements. Your click-through rate depends very heavily on the placement that you choose and also the geography that you target. So Facebook news feeds has consistently the worst click-through rate, but still gets a competitive cost per result just because the advertising space is cheap. And on the other end of the spectrum, Stories has a very high click-through rate, but it's more expensive because more bands try to advertise there. And similar thing goes with Geography, where developing nations have lower click-through rates, but still have competitive cost per result because advertising space is super cheap there. I want to thank Andrew for letting me come onto his channel and show you guys around this little experiment that I've done. I hope you learned something from it, because I know I certainly learned a lot from it, and I'm already using the information that I learned from this campaign to improve the current campaign that I'm running right now and getting the cost down. So keep making music, guys.